All right, hey everybody. Today I've got your study guide slash summary slash discussion of Rothbard's America's Great Depression, Chapter 2. This one's shorter than Chapter 1. It only goes from page 37 to 53, but it's about as dense as the first chapter because we're still covering some pretty hefty economic theory. So we'll get through this as much as we can. There's something rare in here for Rothbard, which is a figure, which I will go into detail a little later on when we get to it. But for now, let's get started and let's figure out what Rothbard's talking about. So, Chapter 2 is titled Keynesian Criticisms of the Theory, and already at the very, very start, the title has a footnote. And the footnote 1, of course, is basically about how Hayek had some very strong criticisms of Keynes's early treatise on money. Most of those criticisms still apply to the general theory, and how after reading lots and lots of Keynes and criticizing and talking back and forth with him, Hayek's conclusion was that Keynes was ignorant of capital theory and real interest theory, particularly that of Bohm-Bawerk, a criticism borne out in Keynes' remarks on Mises' theory of interest. So with that said, we're already kind of off to a rather contentious start, as Rothbard is keen to do. And so let's get started. Basically, Rothbard starts out noting that there are two standard Keynesian criticisms of the Mises cycle theory, or the Austrian Business Cycle theory, or ABCT, as I'll probably abbreviate it. One of these charges takes the followers of Mises to task for identifying saving and investment. That is, the Keynesians are saying, Mises, you are identifying savings and investment is the same thing, whereas we think they're very different things. In the Keynesian view, saving and investment are two separate processes that are done by two separate groups. In the Keynesian view, savings are cash flow. They leak out of consumption, and they end up in cash hoards or cash balances. Investments, on the other hand, pour in from a different phase of the cycle of the economy. You know how Keynesians have that circular price flow diagram thing. The Keynesians say that in the case of a depression, the government should increase investment and decrease savings, which is to say decrease cash balances. And Rothbard counters this. He says, investment and savings are indissolubly linked. They are held together because you can't because the way that Rothbard defines savings is anything not consumed, and therefore any investment must come out of savings in order to, just by definition. The only place where investment can appear and doesn't come from savings is when bank credit expansion happens, and we all know how that goes according to Rothbard from Chapter 1. Basically, Rothbard says that a man can do three things with his money. He can consume it, that is to say he can buy consumers' goods and eat them. He can invest it, that is to say he can take some of his wealth and put it into things that bear returns, capital goods or the equivalents of capital goods. Or he can add to his cash balance. He doesn't necessarily separate these things out into different phases of some circular flow diagram. This Keynesian separation into, okay, first I'm going to choose how much I consume. Then, with what's left over, I'm going to choose how much to invest, and I'm going to leak some into my cash hoard. This distinction is artificial and unnecessary, according to Rothbard. One point I'll note about this chapter is that I noticed that Rothbard uses the word hoards a lot, and I think he really shouldn't be doing this here. He's already convinced us in Chapter 1 that there's no objective definition of what a hoard is, and therefore the term is basically useless for us as economists. And so he really shouldn't be using it here, even with scare quotes. He should just be saying cash balances or whatever, as opposed to playing around with this word and using it in places where maybe it doesn't belong. Rothbard contends that time preference is what decides the ratio of consumption to investment. This makes sense. We talked about this in the first chapter. People who have high time preference consume more and invest less. People with low time preference see that future good as a much more important thing. They invest more and consume less, given any amount of money. The utility of money is what Rothbard says decides how much of savings goes to investments versus cash balances. Here we can't use the hoard word, and here we have to identify the difference between Keynesian saving and Austrian saving. The point that Rothbard is making here is that you must save in order to invest in the first place. The demand for money, that is to say, time preference and the utility of money are two different phenomena, and they're not linked to each other in any significant, obvious way. The demand for money is not related to time preference proportions in any significant way, and therefore these things are not as dependent on each other as the Keynesians say. So that kind of takes care of the first objection. The second objection is what Keynesians call the liquidity trap. Basically, Keynesian theory says that it is possible for the demand for money to go so high, so absurdly high, that the rate of interest cannot go low enough to stimulate enough investment to get the economy out of depression. The Keynesian theory asserts that the rate of interest is determined mostly by liquidity preference, not by time preference. Now, Rothbard's counter to this is that he says that increased savings, increased hoarding, well, not savings, increased cash balances will come from investment and consumption funds per time preference. That is to say, if you decide that you need to have more cash on hand to handle the fact that there's inflation, and therefore you want to have X value in cash balance, then you're going to need to increase your cash balance, but you're going to decrease your consumption and your investment in proportion to your time preference in order to do that. That is, of course, with the exception of cases where people are really, really, really up against the wall in consumption. That is, they can't possibly reduce their consumption anymore. But it's important to note that really only applies to the very, very small margin of people in a modern economy, and so it's a pretty small effect. And so you can pretty much neglect it. Most people can reduce their consumption in a modern first world economy, especially. Rothbard notes that the rate of interest is independent of liquidity preference. That is, the fact that you want to hold a larger cash balance is not dependent upon your time preference. It's dependent upon what money is doing and what you're going to do with the money, right? Rothbard notes that Keynesians also blame speculative hoarding instead of buying, say, bonds for some of the depression's effects. But the problem that Rothbard notes with this is that the rate of interest is not just the price of loans. The price of loans are, of course, an important part of the rate of interest, but they're not the whole thing. All of the capital structure goes into the rate of interest. People in a depression are expecting wages and producers' goods to fall to have their prices fall faster than consumers' good prices, and they adjust accordingly. And this adjustment speeds up the end of the bust. It does what you need the economy to do in order to fix the malinvestments. So, with these two main things knocked out of the way, Rothbard goes on to talk about wage rates and unemployment. So here we go. We are on page 42. So Keynesians assume that wages are rigid downward, and as usual, Rothbard has no tolerance for this kind of nonsense. He notes that this assumption is just an assumption. It is obfuscated by a massive irrelevant equations, but it is still just an assumption of their theory. They assume that the only way to lower real wages is by inflation. Therefore, inflation is necessary in order to get rid of overly high wages. That's basically baked into the Keynesian theory. However, price theory, the price of things, that theory applies to wages just like every other good. Wage controls by government or by unions move workers out of controlled industries to poorer ones. That is to say, if you decide that the wages in a certain industry must be kept artificially high, certain people are going to be left unemployed by that. Those people are going to go into poorer industries where their wages where their productivity is lower and therefore their wages are lower. However, it's even worse than that because, in fact, if those controls are widespread and significant enough, you can actually hinder this correction of people going to lower paying wages, to lower paying jobs. There's plenty of misconceptions in the Keynesian theory, according to Rothbard. For example, the idea that prosperity is caused by high wages, and these can also contribute to the problem. The notion that prosperity is caused by high wages is kind of getting things around. You need the productivity in order to have prosperity, in order to have enough capital goods to make your labor productive enough that you have high wages. So the prosperity is more of a cause of high wages rather than being caused by high wages, if I get that right. There's a side note on page 44 here about the possibility of the bully pulpit or wage mystique dealing with things. I'm just going to read this out because it's kind of fun. Quote, such persuasion has actually been at the root of much of the unemployment of our time, and this is particularly true of the 1929 Depression. Or wait, I have to go a little bit further back, actually. Occasionally, however, the high wage rates are maintained by voluntary choice, although the choice is usually ignorant of the consequences, or by coercion supplemented by voluntary choice. It may happen, for example, that either business firms or the workers themselves become persuaded that maintaining wage rates artificially high is their bounden duty. Such persuasion has actually been at the root of much of the unemployment of the 1929 Depression. Workers, for example, become persuaded of the great importance of preserving the mystique of the union, of union solidarity in not crossing a picket line or not undercutting union wage rates. Unions also almost always reinforce this mystique with violence. But there is no gainsaying the breadth of its influence. Words can do things. To the extent that workers, that's my little side there, back to quote, to the extent that workers both in and out of the union feel bound by this mystique, to that extent they refuse to bid wages downward even when they are unemployed. If they do that, then we must conclude that they are unemployed voluntarily, and that the way to end their unemployment is to convince them that the mystique of the union is morally absurd. It's footnote 9. It is immaterial to the argument whether or not the present writer believes the mystique to be morally absurd. So that paragraph, or that part of that paragraph, applies also to things like Herbert Hoover saying, don't lower wage rates, don't lower wage rates, don't lower wage rates. It has an effect on businesses because, well, there's persuasion there. And that persuasion is partly voluntary and partly involuntary. It's kind of hard to figure out what's what. So another point about from the Keynesians is that they say that a fall in wage rates will reduce demand and therefore prolong the depression. And Rothbard breaks this down. He says, look, real wages are maintained or increased due to deflation during a depression. The Keynesians are confusing wage rates with wage incomes. A wage income is a wage rate times the number of hours worked. Man hours can vary much more, even if we assume that wages are rigid, man hours can vary quite flexibly. And when there's more man hours needed to get the work done at a given wage rate, then there's more employment. The real dynamic, Rothbard says, is the question of labor versus land, and what happens when wage rates fall versus land prices is that producers are driven to add more labor vis-a-vis land, which increases the total wage income. Well, so Rothbard says there's also this other objection. What happens if the demand for labor is inelastic? Well, that must be caused by businesses waiting for wage rates to stop falling. Therefore, the best solution, according to Rothbard, is to not interfere. Let the adjustment happen as fast as it can, and let that problem solve itself. Speculation, as opposed to many economists, Rothbard notes that speculation helps adjustment. It doesn't harm it. Speculation is not self-perpetuating in any meaningful way. Entrepreneurs only make these coordinated clusters of errors, when government or banks create distorted signals about the way that the interest rate is going. So here on pages 48 through 50, we have something very rare not very rare, but we have something fairly rare in a Rothbard book, and that is a figure. Now, I'm going to break down this figure in pretty good detail, and so this is going to take a little while, so hold on to your butts, but here we go. So this isn't the whole figure, but I'm looking at figure 1 on page 48, and this is kind of the free market state of affairs, right? You have a quantity of labor, SL. That is vertical. It's inelastic because that's the amount of necessary labor to avoid involuntary unemployment. Any unemployment beyond SL, that line, that vertical line, is voluntary unemployment by definition. Then we have the demand for labor, which is a curve. For when there's very little labor, when the wage rate is very high, there's not much demand for labor. And when the wage rate is very, very low, the demand for labor goes way up, as you can see. In the free market situation, the wage rate is at the level shown by the horizontal line IE. That's the wage rate per hour that there is. And that wage rate is the equilibrium between the demand for labor and the supply for labor. Pretty simple. Now, what happens if you hold wage rates excessively high? Well, you end up with a situation like this, where the wage rate is at the horizontal line AC. In this case, a certain number of people who really, 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 really need to be employed are unemployed, and the people that are demanding labor know this. What would happen normally in a market if this wasn't hindered is that the producers would bid up or bid down the prices of wages, trying to employ these people who are really, 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 really needing jobs, just in order to keep the lights on, keep themselves fed. And so this, you see the little red line between B and C, that represents the extra demand for jobs that is not being dealt with by the current demand for labor. The horizontal over AC rises vertically upward. Instead of intersecting the demand for labor at point E, the new supply of labor curve intersects at point B. This point now sets the minimum wage rate of 0A. You can see from the bottom that's it's a length, right? But only employs AB workers, leaving BC unemployed. The remedy for this unemployment is to remove the artificial prop that keeps the supply of labor curve at AC, and to permit wage rates to fall until the full employment and equilibrium is reached. Now, the critic might ask, suppose there is not only speculation that will speed adjustment, but speculation that overshoots its mark. The speculative demand for labor can then be considered to be ds/ds. There's our ds/ds. As you can see, that ds/ds curve is below the DL curve for every value, for every quantity of labor, right? That's there. Now what happens is that the wage rate goes to a level of 0J. It's a lower wage rate per hour. Now, when that happens, the true demand for labor, represented by the red line between G and H, is a thing that's going to cause people to say, hey, let me read it. Yeah, the enormous pressure of this true demand, that is people wanting, basically people will say, hey, you're employed for $5 an hour? I'll give you $6 if you work for me over here. Hey, you're working for $6 an hour? I'll pay you $7 over here. And that process will naturally bid the wage prices back up to equilibrium. And so as we can see, holding wage rates above the equilibrium level, i.e., causes unemployment. It might even cause unemployment people who need to work to eat. And speculative demand that overshoots the mark of the adjustment causes a massive effect of demand for labor at higher prices, which would again push things back toward equilibrium. So that is figure 1 there. I hope this has been pretty clear. There's a solid page and a half of text here in the actual version. So if you want to go through it, I had to go through it maybe twice slowly in order to kind of understand Rothbard's point here. But I added the red lines because I thought they were a little bit helpful, and hopefully they helped you understand what parts he's talking about when he's talking about bits. But you can go back to the book and go through this, and it is possible to understand it. Let's talk about the next thing. Keynesians. They implicitly assume downward wage rigidity, and therefore Keynesian theory cannot be used to criticize a policy of freely falling wage rates. If they think wage rates naturally can't fall, then a policy that allows wage rates to fall, they can't argue against it because it can't possibly hurt, can it? It can't happen anyway. Given a total money supply, the total flow of spending will only decline if the social demand for money goes up. That is to say, people increase their hoards. Now, this was a point that I thought was a little bit, possible to maybe argue against. There might be other ways to decrease the total flow of spending that don't involve the social demand for money increasing. Again, that might be something we're thinking about or writing about later on. However, Rothbard notes that even if this happened, this is not a calamity. It is only a natural part of the correction. It has to happen to get rid of those malinvestments. The above-market wages discourage investment. They increase hoarding at the expense of investment, by which cash savings, right? This exacerbates the problem and doesn't do what you want to happen to end the bust. The Keynesians say that wage earners consume a larger proportion of their income, but this is not necessarily true. Mickey Mantle is the example that Rothbard gives, is a laborer. Any person who, any professional sports star is a laborer in the Keynesian formulation. This is a really clumsy way, that is to say, manipulating relations between wage earners and others is a very clumsy and ineffective way of manipulating relations between poor and rich, because those aren't the same groups. And that's provided that we want any manipulation at all, and Rothbard would argue we don't. So, yeah, even if that's true, we want less consumption and more savings. And this is not a good way to do that. Artificially high wage rates lead to a reduction in hours worked. Well, what if that happens? Well, that can either be unemployment of a person entirely, or a reduction in the amount of time that they work, the number of hours that they have. When you make people underemployed versus unemployed, you spread the problem around. But what that also does, in addition to spreading the problem around, is that it makes working less efficient and it aggravates problems. The underemployed person is less likely to press for reduced wage rates because they're already underemployed. And so this also hinders the movement of wage rates to their proper, appropriate equilibrium position. Yeah, reduction of hours to share the work will also reduce everyone's real wage rate, and the general standard of living for production will not only be lower, but undoubtedly far less efficient, and workers all less productive. This will further widen the gap between the artificially maintained wage rate and the free market wage rate, and hence further aggravate the unemployment problem. So, that is how Rothbard ends Chapter 2. He's, in his mind, he's hit most of the major Keynesian critiques. Chapter 3 is some alternative explanations of depression, a critique, in which I guess Rothbard's going to explain a few different alternate ways to explain why a depression happens, and to explain why those explanations are wrong. So, yeah, that's kind of where we're at here. Definitely an interesting chapter because it covers a lot of an opposing theory and what that theory kind of assumes, and why, and gives good solid reasons why its assumptions are wrong. So yeah, I think that's all we've got for today. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of Chapter 2 of Rothbard's America's Great Depression. That figure is moderately hard to understand because unlike the version that I made where there was 3 different stages to show how things go, in the book it's just one big blob of lines and stuff. And they're all the same color, and it's a little bit difficult to figure out. So I hope that helped out. I hope you I hope you learned something from this. I'll be going through Chapter 3, and we'll see how it goes, and we'll have another episode hopefully up next week. So as always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. I've got some other fun stuff that's going to be coming up in the next few days. Hopefully, if I can get some time to make some videos. Rothbard's America's Great Depression. Give it a read. There will be a link in the description to a free version as well as versions that you can buy. And I highly recommend it, and I'd love to have you follow along and ask questions in the comments if you want. Hopefully I'll be able to give them some reasonable answers, or at least point you towards some articles that help clarify what the issue is. So anyway, thanks again, and I will see you all next time.